we've got a lot to cover in the next hour or so, so we'll crack on. So my background is I did a PhD talking to various people in various different roles to do with calf rearing in the dairy sector, and something that kept on coming up was a bit of confusion, maybe some mixed messaging, and calf feeding was one of those areas. So based off that PhD, I have set up the Calf Action Network, which welcomes various people, whether they be actively calf rearing, working in industry or research, to talk about calves and how we can maybe bridge those gaps between what's happening in research and what's actually happening on farms. So today, as part of GB Calf Week, I thought it would be great to get some of our Calf Action Network members together to talk about this topic of calf feeding, which quite often can be quite a confusing area. So getting everyone together in the room to discuss the topic seemed like a good idea. If I could ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Jessica.
Good afternoon. So as Laura said, I am Dr. Jessica Cooke, Research and Development Manager for Young Animal at Volac. Prior to joining Volac, I did a PhD at the Royal Veterinary College looking at the impact of factors during the calf rearing period on the subsequent performance of heifers once they enter the milking herd. In my current role, I'm responsible for taking the latest scientific data and feeding it into our innovations process for product development, but also using the latest science to actually provide best practice advice for rearing calves and heifers on a farm. So look forward to discussions over the next hour on this area.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And next up, we've got Bianca.
Good afternoon. I'm Bianca Theeruth. I'm Ruminant Technology Application Specialist at Cargill. And in my role, I will work with our innovation team and as well as the research and development team, and responsible for deploying all of that R&D on farm practically in a commercial sense. And I've been with Cargill since 2014.
Great, thank you, Bianca. And next along, we've got Georgina.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Georgina Thomas. I'm the Young Animal Feed Manager at Trouw Nutrition. I'm hugely passionate about all things calf nutrition, so I spend a lot of my time doing similar roles to Bianca and Jessica, really, speaking to people about all things calf nutrition and developing research and the latest science into practical and achievable solutions for farm. So I spend a lot of my time looking at milk replacer formulations, the latest publications, setting up trials, but also getting out on farm to understand what is successful and what is not successful. As we all know, all calf rearing systems are different and have different goals. So making sure that we're aware of that and can learn from being on farm as well is really important, I think. So looking forward to discussions today.
Great, thank you, Georgina. And Anne?
Good afternoon, I'm Anne Coombes and I am the Young Stock Product Manager for ForFarmers. And my role, we are mainly looking at the effect that our products have on performance on farms for young stock. Specifically, we've got a young stock team, so it's making sure that our team members are offering a great service to our customers. That's putting protocols together, setting up trials on farm, weighing. We offer a weighing service, setting bespoke targets for farms. And like everyone else, obviously, a huge interest of mine is the young animal sector, and obviously the nutrition that we can implement on farm to achieve targets, and setting targets is something that I'm quite big on as well.
Great, thank you, Anne. And last but by no means least, Emma.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emma Bleach, and I'm a senior lecturer here at Harper University. And I have a sort of joint teaching and research role. So in terms of teaching, I'm teaching undergrads, and part of that would involve teaching best practice for calf rearing, for dairy bred calves. And I'm also get involved with a lot of applied near market type research projects, research trials that we'll run here on the Harper Adams University farm. So yeah, a huge variety of different trials that we've run here. And then also just to reinforce my interest, we have a farm back home, so I just keep an eye on what's going on there in terms of the practicalities of calf and heifer rearing. Okay.
Great, thank you all for the very comprehensive but quick introductions. Very, very nice to see. So as I said, kind of what brought me here today is around kind of confusion that I was seeing from my research around particularly calf feeding. We got as far as, you know, historic practices of feeding 2 litres twice a day, 4 litres in total isn't enough milk to give to calves. But then we end up with sort of these almost if you're just looking at the cursory going, okay, so some are recommending pushing starter intake, some are recommending pushing milk intakes. So if you could kind of maybe if we start with Georgina, maybe around around sort of where you stand with this kind of recommendation.
Yeah, so I appreciate there's a lot of confusing messages out there, and I think myself and a lot of the panelists will agree there's some fundamental areas of calf research which will hopefully get filled in over the next few years, because there's a lot of stuff that we still don't know, or still don't necessarily understand. But from my perspective, as I said in my introduction, there's no such thing as a calf rearing blueprint. There's many different ways that you can achieve success, and setting your own objectives and setting your own targets, it's what's really important. However, from my point of view, I'm a big advocate of feeding more milk where it's appropriate and suitable. So we need to think about environment and feeding method and all those sorts of things. But for me, feeding more milk offers usable nutrients in early life. And that allows us to have this metabolic programming effect, or this epigenetic effect, so we can unlock that genetic potential. But it also helps to support optimal development, which can help to drive productivity and such like later on in life. However, it's not all about milk. Starter feed is equally as important. So later on in life and moving through that weaning period, we then need to start to think about how are we strategically going to wean that calf, and then making sure that we transfer from milk to starter is really important. So from my side, milk is really important to get us going, but then transferring to starter successfully is also a key part of what we need to do.
And maybe if we bring in Bianca there as
a lot of similarities to what Georgina has said. You know, certainly from our perspective, I don't believe it's an either or. It's not milk or starter, but actually harnessing the benefits of both and actually combining both in a way that's practical to be applied on farm, you know, so we can achieve the objectives we want to. And as Georgina alluded to, you know, there is no one size fits all. All calf rearing systems are different. You know, we've got breed differences where some breeds may be more tolerant of a higher level of milk, whereas some breeds may be less tolerant. But I think from my perspective, as an industry, what we need to do is actually quantify by what we mean by more milk, you know, because as you alluded to in your introduction, Laura, you know, sort of feeding calves 2 litres sort of twice a day, you know, sort of for argument's sake, say, you know, 500 grams, you know, is 500 grams of milk replacer per calf per day enough to sustain the kind of growth rates we want? No, probably not. So in that case, you know, feeding more milk, you know, sort of would be one way of increasing growth rates. But I think what we really need to do is quantify by what we mean by more. Because if we've got someone who's already feeding 1.2 kilos of milk, by going up to 1.5 kilos of milk, you know, what are we gaining? And also to bring some economics into it, you know, with the cost of milk replacer, you know, with other resources on farm, there is a cost attached to all of this. And if you certainly have a look at some of the research that's coming out of Penn State, you know, in terms of that lifetime genetic potential, it's a combination of calf starter intake and the milk or milk replacer feeding program. So it's not an either or. And another thing we've also got to remember is that the rumen develops in response to all of the starter that the calf has eaten during the pre-weaning period and not just an amount on a given day when it's coming up to weaning. So, you know, as Georgina alluded to, you know, there are some great nutrients that we want to sort of, we want to take advantage on early in life, but we also have to remember that we need to develop the rumen. So let's see how we can actually balance milk and calf starter to be able to achieve the targets that we're striving for.
Thanks, Bianca. So actually, Jessica, your PhD was looking into kind of into targets for heifers. Anything that you've kind of gained insight from that, and potential gaps which Bianca and Georgina have alluded to there being in research?
No, I very much sort of agree with what Bianca and Georgina have said in terms of there's an awful lot of research showing that by feeding calves higher volumes of milk, that's going to very much support the early growth and development and, importantly, health of these calves during the milk feeding period. But, you know, alongside that, as Bianca and Georgina have said, we must remember the importance of starter, because starter intake is the single most important factor driving that rumen development. And we need to make sure these calves are approaching weaning with well-developed rumen so they can actually go on to utilise the nutrients when the milk's removed. In terms of, you know, again, thinking about how much, you know, that very much depends on the targets that have been set for a specific farm. So what sort of growth rate are you aiming for? And also not forgetting, obviously we're talking about nutrition, but we mustn't forget sort of the environmental and health challenges that will all determine how much of the energy in that milk feed can be used for growth, as opposed to keeping that calf warm and fighting disease. And so when we're looking at, you know, how much to feed, if you've got your set growth rate laid out and you know you're aiming for 0.7, 0.8 kilos of growth per day, I think one of the key areas which possibly there's still not quite enough research into is actually then looking at how we can use that feed conversion efficiency ratio. So if we know that the calf is going to convert its feed at 50%, so you can actually work out how much feed is going in relative to the growth rate you're getting back out. But of course that doesn't always sort of it doesn't account for the environment and the health challenges. So I think that's an area where more research is needed in terms of what these young calves can actually achieve in sort of everyday farm situations.
Thanks, Jessica. So Anne, in terms of these practical things, that's a passion of yours of making things work on farms. What do you think are some considerations to really take account of? We've alluded to, you know, every farm's different and tailoring things, but what sort of things are you looking at when you are making these targeted tailored targets?
So for me, the first 3 weeks of a calf's life is where we really struggle, because they aren't consuming the amount of concentrate that they need to. They don't physically do that, especially in the first 3 weeks. So for me, it's making sure that we set the key nutritional targets that they need to achieve every day, and that's considered from day one. So if you're looking at the daily protein requirement and your megajoules of energy required per day, how do you achieve that? Is that by, for example, everything leads us to saying that we need to feed a kilo of milk. So for me, how I've approached this recently is by, if possible, again, every farm is completely different, but if possible, looking at a way of maybe feeding 3 times a day, if that suits the farm situation, if they've got machines or if they don't have machines, but looking at maybe getting an extra feed in per day, if that's a way of increasing the amount of powder that we can get into those calves per day. It's certainly in those first 3 weeks. But I think something that as an industry we need to work a lot harder on is every farm having a specific protocol, whether that's around calving and colostrum, but certainly also into management, hygiene, and daily feeding. If there's a protocol on that farm, then if there's multiple people feeding the calves over a weekly period, then those protocols can be used and the same system be used every day. So just all about making it as easy as possible so that we can do the job as well as we can, but also sticking to some clear objectives that are able to be achieved whether there's 5 people feeding in 1 week or not.
Thanks, Em. And Emma, in terms of the kind of trials that you get involved in, are there kind of common themes around those and potential areas that you almost like wish that you could do trials on, but no one's approached you yet?
Just thinking about the early life phase, a lot of what we do is working with either the dairy heifer calf that will be reared as a replacement, or the dairy bull calf that's come from our dairy herd. But I think largely probably looking more at the heifers of late. We have increased the amount of milk feed that we would give them in early life. And just some of the things that we then see, we've got calves in individual hutches, so we can monitor concentrate intake for those calves. And we do start to see that picking up from week 2 to 3 typically. But there's a lot of variation. And these calves, they're being fed on a flat rate of milk. We will monitor concentrate intake through to weaning at 8 weeks. Of course, when we start to step down milk in the approach to weaning, we'll see an increase, generally speaking, in concentrate intake, but there is a huge amount of variation. And even, you know, in day 56, when these calves are at an age where we would start to think about weaning them, we do have huge variation in concentrate intake. And they're on the same concentrate, but they may be consuming 1.5 kilos a day, they may be consuming 200 grams a day. And similar sized calves, you know, we're looking at calves that are generally speaking fairly uniform. They've been on the same milk, but gearing them up for weaning, and that's what we're doing when we're putting that concentrate in front of them, gearing them up to weaning. We do see this, you know, huge variation. So when we take that milk away, potentially we've got some calves that are going to go through a very tricky transition period. If we wean on age, we don't have to wean on age, but if we wean on age.
Are there any
Perhaps
ideas?
we'll just throw that out to the other guys, maybe to.
Yeah, I was going to say, any ideas what might be contributing to that kind of variation?
Have they all been fed in the same type of bucket, or is there different types of buckets being used on this as well?
We can be feeding them the same pellet from the same bucket inside hutch. They're on the same milk. They've been fed milk from teated bottles. Everything is, you know, very, very similar. We see these big differences in concentrate intake. And for guys feeding them in a group setting, you won't necessarily be able to see that variation in intake. You know, if a pen's clearing up an amount of concentrate that you're putting in front of them, you can work out the average. It may be 1.5 for the pen, but there will be some that are consuming perhaps very little.
Jessica, did you want to jump in?
Just a note on, I think there is a paper out there somewhere that I have read at some point showing that actually calves, they just take different amounts of time to increase amounts and actually to learn to eat that starter. Similarly, how, you know, heifers, when we put them out to grass, they actually have to learn to graze, and they all take very different amounts of time to learn to either graze or actually eat the starter. So there is some data just showing huge variation, like exactly how Emma's sort of described in terms of how much they eat. And when you approach weaning, they're all eating very different amounts.
Mm-hmm. Right, and we have a question in the chat. So yes, anyone who's joined us a little bit later, please do find your way down to the chat box. If you have any comments or questions, you can type them in there and we will come to them periodically. So we've got a question from Esme. she'd be interested in the panel's opinion on the idea that a minimum quantity of starch needs to have been fed before weaning for rumen development. So maybe Bianca, you can start off with that.
Thanks, Laura. Great question, Esme. You know, sort of one of the sort of ideas of when a calf is ready to be weaned that we at Cargill have explored is actually looking at the cumulative non-fiber carbohydrate intake. So for those people on the call that are maybe not aware, what I mean by non-fiber, it would be sugar, starch, and pectin. And the number we've sort of calculated from previous trials that we've published is that when calves have consumed 15 kilos of cumulative NFC intake over that pre-weaning period, that would be a good indicator that the rumen is ready and sufficiently mature enough to be able to transition, you know, from a liquid feed onto a solid feed. So 15 kilos of cumulative NFC intake. So when does that occur? And that's really going to depend on your feeding program. But what we've seen from the trials is that it's somewhere between 54 and 64 days of age. And then also, I think the sort of related to the question was what kind of starch levels are we looking at? And that's really going to depend on the presentation of the calf starter feed. So for example, if I was feeding like a sort of a textured feed, like a muesli feed, I am able to put, you know, sort of certain carbohydrates in, you know, sort of in a whole form or in a sort of a partially sort of manufactured form. But from a sort of a course mix perspective, you know, some of the Cargill work has demonstrated levels sort of about 40% starch, up to sort of 45%. If I'm looking at a pellet, because a lot of my ingredients are finely ground, I'm kind of probably looking at starch levels of about, you know, not more than 25%. And if I was feeding a meal, we're looking at not more than sort of 20%, because, you know, with a lot of these calf starters that have been processed sort of quite finely, what we don't want to, you know, cause is sort of quick digestion and a potential for acidosis in the calves. So hopefully that answers Esme's question.
Great, thanks, Bianca. Does anyone else have anything to add to Bianca's response? Nope. Okay, good. We've also got another question from the chat, which maybe Georgina, with your metabolic programming, that one might be come into that. How much does the calving experience, so ease, speed, time with dam, affect ongoing feed intake or behaviour? Is that something that you've looked at?
It's an interesting question, and I think there's minimal research on those sort of areas. But I think if you think practically, stressful calving or stressful situations is going to lead to sort of high levels of cortisol circulating in that calf, and that's going to have an impact on how they're going to feed or how well they're going to feed potentially, because cortisol circulating in the system can really have a big impact. We've seen it in cows for a long time, so I'm sure it can have a huge impact in calves demonstrating their behaviour as well. And it really depends upon, I suppose, what else has happened in that calving. Have they been starved of oxygen? Has anything else happened? So I anticipate a difficult calving is going to have knock-on effects on how quickly that calf's going to get up, how strong their suckling reflex is, what else they've got going on within their bodies. I don't think there's, unless Jessica or Bianca's aware, I'm not aware of any particular research looking at calving ease on calf feeding behaviour that early in life. But I anticipate if we think about the biological mechanisms, there's going to be some impact of stress at calving on those early feeding patterns, I believe, anyway.
Laura, just to add to what Georgina has said, there have been sort of papers that have been published to actually show that a difficult calving will affect first lactation milk yield. And in some situations, you know, you're kind of looking at a difference of almost 700 kilos of milk that's produced in the first lactation, you know, if a calf has, you know, had to be pulled or cesarean or that kind of thing. So yeah, definitely, Georgina, in support of what you said, but I'm also not aware on how that would affect later a feeding behavior.
Great. So we've identified a potential research gap. So right. So on that kind of note around stress and things, obviously a lot of the research focuses on calf performance, growth rates, how they perform later in life. What about kind of the welfare aspect of calf rearing? How much attention do you think that gets? maybe we'll go back to Anne or Jessica, as we've not heard from you for a little while.
Yeah, I think the welfare situation is something that as an industry it's becoming more and more focused upon. Certainly for dairy milk producers, that's something that, along with milk contracts now, is obviously becoming high importance for that as well. But I think it's about making important changes, and not necessarily always to make your life easier, but to make the life easier for the calf. I think that's something that we need to be quite mindful of as well. But certainly a lot of the work that's been done around the group housing, that side of things, it's really interesting looking at that. But also water being quite an interesting one. Certainly when I was running around on farms about 10 years ago, it would be astonishing how few cases I'd see of water being available, certainly at, in the first few days of life. Whereas now I do feel like it's something that everyone is progressing with, that side of things, making sure fresh, clean water is available at all times. But it's making sure that everyone kind of, whether it's nutritionists, veterinarians, farm workers, everyone has to put some kind of ownership on making sure that welfare levels are adhered to on farms.
Jessica, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Anne in terms of, I mean, the welfare, I think, sits hand in hand in terms of our previous discussions, just thinking about those high milk fed calves and actually how we can encourage starter intake. When we list, and as Anne did, actually 4 key things to actually encourage starter intake in the high milk fed calf, very much encompass welfare in terms of making sure they've got water available, the pair housing or group housing. There's a lot of data out there showing that actually if you group or pair house from sort of the first week of life, that's actually going to encourage starter intake. And of course, then that's the sort of the knock-on impact on the welfare of those calves, and sort of looking at the sort of the playful activity that they can then sort of engage in. And then last 2 things, again, just thinking about how you can encourage starter intake, providing chop forage alongside starter. And then actually just weaning over a 3-week period, which again, when we're thinking about welfare, actually wean them gradually over a 3-week period so that they do start to eat more starter. So then when you come to wean them, it's not a huge shock and you don't get those setbacks in growth by, if they haven't been eating enough starter. So, especially providing water, the pair group housing, and just weaning more gradually, that's going to obviously help the high milk fed calf eat more starter. But I think they're the key things when we're thinking about welfare for these young calves on farm, to sort of reduce stress as well.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Does anyone else want to jump in on the topic of welfare? Or
well, we go back, turn it round to the chair, because your PhD showed that there were concerns from some of the stakeholders with regard to welfare of the calves. In particular, hunger was one of the things that I do remember stood out from your interviews. What was your sort of feeling from that angle?
Yeah, so I think it depends on also sort of where you're coming from with welfare. Is, yes, obviously baseline being the 5 freedoms of, you want to prevent negative states for animals. So as I said, mentioned right at the start, kind of these traditional feeding practices of 2 litres twice a day not being enough, so concern about hungry calves, also the elements of weather and so forth being an issue. Personally, my background being in animal welfare, you can also go beyond that with the kind of more positive welfare idea of, can you offer like valuable and exciting opportunities? Can you give calves interesting things to interact with? Can you offer them choice? Can you offer them positive experiences as well as preventing those negative things? And primarily the people I spoke to were kind of focusing on those elements that we've already, that Anne and Jessica already kind of alluded to. Are we getting the basics right? Are we providing water? Are we feeding enough? Are we allowing them to be healthy calves as a cornerstone of welfare before being able to go on to then offer those more exciting opportunities? And there's so much variation between different farms, some of which are really focusing on their calf rearing and are going above and beyond in terms of welfare, and those who are still not really focusing on it. So Georgina, I saw you also wanted to say something as well.
It's a massive topic, welfare, isn't it? A huge topic, because it's how do you quantify welfare? Are we looking at things like mortality and morbidity rates, like you say? Are we looking at calf behaviour? But it's such a massive topic, and I know welfare and behaviour now, if you look at a lot of these researchers globally, are focusing on sort of calf behaviour as well as alongside nutrition. But there was an interesting study that looked at sort of cognitive behaviour in relation to hunger, which I think came out earlier this year, or you might know better than I do. But they basically restricted calves from 12 litres to 6 litres and looked at how long it took calves to relearn skills. So they basically had 15 bottles of milk, I think, and they had 4 bottles of those milk were full and the rest were empty. And it just looked at, depending upon how much milk those calves got, how quickly they learnt where the milk was. And then if they moved the milk bottles, how quickly they would relearn. And it was actually really interesting, showing that there was actually a detrimental effect on reducing milk on things like learning. So I think there's huge aspects that are only just almost starting to be considered around welfare. So yeah, it's a huge topic. And then when you think about some of the technology that we've got available in regards to some of our automatic feeders, for example, looking at drinking speed, and then there's work being done at Nottingham, I know, looking at actually drinking speed or drinking behaviours, giving us an indication sort of 2 to 3 days before a calf actually might become poorly or might become ill. So I think it's a combination of some of this latest research and then optimising the technology that we've got to try and support welfare where we can as well.
Yeah, very good points. Bianca, did you want to...
Sorry, the study that you're reporting, Georgina, that really, the situation that they're setting up there is really what we're doing with calves at weaning. So we're some occasions, we're stepping them down massively over that weaning period and potentially affecting that calf. And it is then shown with his assessment of their cognitive behaviour. That, yeah, with our big steps down in milk feeds at weaning, we are potentially having some big impacts that we can't fully quantify.
Yeah, and it comes back to Jessica's point, doesn't it, Emma, on an adequate weaning period. So Jessica mentioned a 3-week weaning period, and I think that's when it becomes really important, is if we're feeding high levels of milk, we can't wean a calf over a week, over 2 weeks. It's going to take a lot longer, because we can't take 50% reductions. As like you say, it's going to have some of the impacts that were shown in this study. So giving enough time to achieve our goals, I think, as well, is an important factor.
Great, thank you. And actually that brings us round to another question from the chat on starter feeds. Some people give ad libs, others give a ration. There's ambiguity on the correct way to introduce feed and how to avoid upsetting the calves regardless of weaning length. So are there any kind of ideas for what would be best practice? And we've already talked about every farm needing kind of a tailored approach, but so are there any kind of key things to get right in a facility where water is available from birth, roughage to increase rumen, good hygiene, etc.? Who would like to jump in on that one?
I can certainly start, Laura, because I know that some of the panel will also have some other ideas that perhaps I don't mention. But I think with starter, it's little and often. It needs to be fresh and offered little and often. A calf who's a week old is not going to be eating out of not going to be eating 2 kilos of starter. So you might sort of at birth start, well, we want to be feeding starter sort of at birth alongside water and our forage. But yes, to keep it fresh, to keep it palatable, to keep it tasty, and also to increase it as the calf is, you know, certainly getting older, but not just putting a big sort of heat down. And I know Anne might mention, you know, sort of the size of the feeding sort of vessel, you know, something shallow as opposed to, you know, sort of a bucket where a calf's got to sort of put their head into, and that, you know, can also be quite a negative experience. But I would say a good quality starter that's offered, you know, sort of ad lib, and is fresh and is tasty. And also we've got to think about minimizing the number of changes that happen around weaning, because weaning is a stressful period as well. So if you're going to be doing a whole lot of jobs, you know, on either side of weaning, also just to make sure that we keep, you know, sort of leading up to weaning as stress-free as possible. And then again, also after weaning, because if you're going to be vaccinating, if you're going to be moving, if you're going to be dropping milk, if you're going to be changing buildings, you know, those in itself are all stressful events, you know, which could have an impact on performance.
I totally agree with everything Bianca said. The bucket size or feeding vessel size is quite a big thing, and certainly something that I found in those first 3 weeks makes quite a big difference. But another big thing that we see a problem with is the amount of feed, like you were suggesting. So, you know, certainly in the first few days, a small handful is almost more than enough, and cannot stress enough about the palatability of the feed as well. Certainly making sure that the feed is as palatable as possible. So when we're looking at investing into feeds in that young stage, I always think that because of the feed conversion ratio and the extreme benefits that it can have on rumen developing by feeding a good starter at that stage, you're always better off spending the money in that first 12 weeks and on the best products. And certainly a palatable starter feed would be one of them, and minimizing the changes at weaning. Cannot stress that enough. It's even sometimes just as much as changing from a starter pellet to a, you know, a rearing nut quite often gets done at weaning as well, and that can also cause a bit of stress as well. So just trying to make it as consistent as possible in that first milk feeding stage, and certainly minimal starter feed to start with. Mouldy starter feed in the bottom of a damp bucket is not particularly inviting for anyone.
Thanks, Anne.
Laura, I'd probably just add I know this that forage would be available, but just a note on forage again, just some good data out there showing actually the value of chopped forage as opposed to sort of long straw, because the chopped forage, it's sort of been described to me in the past as acting a bit like a toothpick, cleaning out those rumen papillae, helping to keep the rumen healthy. And then data showing that actually if you offer chopped forage separately to the starter, those calves actually eat more starter because of the benefit of that chopped forage for keeping the rumen healthy. If it's not practical to offer chopped forage in a bucket separate to the starter, then as a minimum, always just sort of long straw in racks, and make sure you are providing forage that's off the ground. You know, straw bedding is not enough. They actually need dedicated forage to eat as feed. So ideally chopped forage in a bucket separate to the starter, but if that's not possible, then straw in racks is sort of the next best thing.
Yes, that aspect is hugely important. What would you go for in terms of chop length, Jessica?
3 to 4 centimeters seems to be the one that again, just from the research and the data that people tend to use.
Really interesting. We've just started offering chopped straw in. We've been putting it on top of the bucket for the older animals, the older calves that are on starter pellet. We've been putting chopped straw on top, and it's the same chopped straw that the dairy cows get. And really interesting, the amount of chopped straw that has been consumed as opposed to what was fed in the straw racks is yeah, really interesting, and the calves look absolutely fantastic on it as well.
Great, thanks everyone. Colin also asks in the chat, clean chopped forage or a molassed one?
I don't have any experience of a molassed one. I would say the clean chopped forage, so just, yeah, clean chopped straw. Or I know we've always steered away from hay in the past in terms of sort of ending up with pot-belly calves, but again, data showing that actually if these calves are on a high volume of milk, they sort of actually limit the amount of forage intake themselves. So don't go if you offer them chopped hay, they don't tend to eat too much of it to end up with the problems we would have probably encountered in the past when we weren't feeding calves enough milk, so they would be very hungry and then would sort of go and eat too much hay. But yeah, I would always sort of say clean chopped straw.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So just in the interest of time, we'll move on the topic a little bit. We've got another question in the chat from Lizzie asking about thoughts on feeding yogurt, as she's seen a few farmers trying that out this year. Might be linked with probiotics. I think I spoke to a few farmers who were using that when I was doing my PhD. All very, very quiet. No takers for jumping in on that one.
Laura, yeah, I've seen it sort of practically happening on some farms where, you know, yogurt is added to the milk replacer feed. You know, sort of generally if they've had, you know, sort of a case of digestive upset, and as you were saying, sort of, you know, with a probiotic effect. But, you know, I think with all these things, it needs to be practical and you need to handle it in a clean and hygienic way. You know, or you could actually just look at a milk replacer that perhaps has a probiotic in that will be delivering, you know, a set amount of beneficial bacteria, you know, rather than, you know, sort of maybe putting in spoons of it and things like that. But yes, you know, you can add yogurt to the milk replacer, and yeah, lots of other ways to get good beneficial bacteria into the milk replacer.
I've seen quite a few people adding yogurt to whole milk. The obviously situation with the national milk price the way it is, there's so people feeding it through whole milk. My concerns with that is the consistency. Every day your whole milk is changing on a daily basis, and your vitamin mineral requirements as well. So I would just say if people are looking to do it, cleanliness being a huge importance, because you have to leave it to sit for a certain amount of time as well. So cleanliness and consistency, and also sometimes we can be quite blindsided by something that we think is going to be a lot cheaper because we've got lots of milk. Milk replacer is expensive, but I think actually be mindful to actually sit down and work out how much extra time is that going to take, the extra equipment that you may need to do that. Really sit down and work out economically exactly how much it is going to cost to do that, and if there is a cost benefit. But certainly cleanliness and consistency need to be achieved if you are doing that, and sometimes that does mean having to also so you're acidifying the milk, but you're also have to look at adding a prebiotic to the whole milk as well to achieve those vitamin and mineral requirements.
Great, thank you, Anne. So again, just in the interest of time, as we approach the 10 minutes left of our webinar mark, in terms of kind of the targets and key performance indicators, I've seen some questions about, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of focus on dairy beef animals that we're rearing. Do you need to approach that differently to if you're rearing replacements, and also targets for small breeds like jerseys? Lots of people say that targets focus on black and white, so how do we approach those kinds of slightly different breeds and end products, I guess?
I think your initial target of looking at doubling your birth weight at weaning is kind of across the whole board. So regardless of whether it's a Jersey or a beef calf, I think doubling birth weight at weaning should always be one of the key targets. But it also depends what your end goal is. So is that you're dairy and you're trying to achieve 24 months calving, or if that doesn't suit your system and you're trying to achieve younger or older, making sure that you know your end goal before you then start setting younger targets. And whether that's if you're on a beef system, are you trying to finish at 18 months or are you finishing at 20 months, so that you can work back and know exactly what your targets need to be throughout the whole process. But certainly Jersey calves do need to be treated completely differently as opposed to a big rangy Holstein. And then it depends on what your feeding plan is going forward. Are you grazing or are you intensely housing? It's about setting a target to suit your specific system and what your system allows as well. Not necessarily achievable targets need to be set, because it's pointless setting a target that your system can't even achieve as well. So again, there's too many options really to give one blueprint for that, but I would always say doubling birth weight at weaning across any type of range is one that I would go to.
Laura, when you look at some of the different systems that you mentioned, for me the fundamentals of sort of calf rearing apply. So sort of a good colostrum management program, a good pre-weaning program, sort of starter feed. We've talked about welfare, we've talked about environment, we've talked about morbidity and mortality. A lot of those targets that we have will be shared, amongst those different sectors when we look at sort of rearing that calf in those first few months of life. And then I guess depending on, sort of whichever system you might be supplying calves to, they will have live weight targets that they want you to reach, within a specific time. But for me, sort of those first 3 or 4 months of life, we need to make sure we get the calf off to a good start, whether it be a replacement heifer or whether it be, in a dairy beef system. We do need to get the basics right and give them a good start.
I would just add to that in terms of thinking about our replacement heifers. Again, I think as an industry, we focus a lot on age at first calving, but actually the body weight at first calving is just as key as the age of them, because the body weight when they calve down for the first time was sort of, if they're the right body weight, it will reduce the risk of calving difficulties, and actually body weight can then go on to steer their subsequent fertility. So we should be aiming for sort of 85 to 90% of their mature body weight at first calving, and whether that's 24 months or whether you've set that target for sort of 25, 26 months for your particular system, it's the body weight at first breeding that's key. And then once you've set the age that you're aiming for and you know what the body weight of your animals should be at first calving based on the mature body weight of cows in your herd, so that's sort of lactation 3 or 4, then you can work everything back from there. So then what daily live weight gain those animals need to achieve from day 1 through until the point of first calving to be on track for calving down with adequate body size. And that's, I think, the biggest take home I would say to every farm is to go and measure some cows in lactation 3 or 4, so you know what the mature body weight of cows on your herd is, and then you can work everything back from there.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So we've got another couple of questions coming in for the last few minutes. So Emma asks, any recommendations for introducing bought-in calves to the rearing unit where they perhaps don't know their background, milk on farm of origin, etc.?
That's a really challenging one. I think bought-in calves are probably everyone's biggest challenge because of the unknown background. I think the first thing I would suggest is make sure that they're well hydrated. So make sure if you need to, depending upon where they've been or how long they haven't been fed for, often offering an electrolyte or something similar to make sure they're fully hydrated will then mean that they drink well. Often you find that dehydrated calves might start to refuse milk, and then you can get sort of caught in a little bit of a vicious cycle. So depending upon where they've come from, I think hydration and making sure they're well hydrated when they arrive is a really key thing. And also perhaps keeping, easier in some systems than others, but perhaps keeping a note of actually how calves perform from different sources if you have the opportunity to choose your sources. I know many of us don't, but trying to keep an eye on actually where are the calves that are doing really well, where are they coming from, for example, because then you can sort of understand perhaps what might happen before they arrive with you with regards to colostrum and milk and all those sorts of things, because that can have a big impact. And often we're not getting those calves until they're sort of 14 to 21 days of age, and that's obviously after their vulnerable period with regards to colostrum antibodies and active immunity. So it's a big challenge. I think it's always going to be a big challenge, but colostrum status, but also making sure that we're understanding where those calves are coming from, and if we can have any influence on that, which I appreciate can be limited at some points.
Thank you, Georgina. So we've also got another question. Does breed affect the efficiency of feed conversion at the calf stage within a dairy beef, or should the quality of genetics be taken more into account, potentially using AI instead of a herd bull? Or is that another sort of research gap in terms of breed effect on feed conversion?
I think Jessica mentioned right at the beginning that feed efficiency is a massive area of research that probably needs a little bit more focus. So I'm not necessarily aware of any published research on feed efficiency in relation to breed. I think we probably all know that there are some breeds that are easier to get teat trained and easier to feed than others. Some can be more stubborn. That's just anecdotal evidence. But from an efficiency point of view, I'm not aware that there's any research out there showing differences in efficiencies by breed. But anyone else on the panel can share some light unless I've missed something.
No, I'm not aware of breed having an effect. And of course, I think in terms of that feed efficiency, it's going to be the health and the environment of those calves that are going to have such a big impact. You know, for the young calf less than 3 weeks of age, temperature only needs to drop down to less than 10 to 15 degrees C, and that calf's going to have to use more of the energy from its feed to keep warm. And then of course any disease challenge that those calves are exposed to, they're going to be using more of their energy to mount that immune response, because mounting an immune response is a considerable energetic demand. So I think breed probably has quite a small impact compared to the rest of those challenges that are going to have huge impacts on the feed conversion efficiency.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So as we approach the last few minutes of the webinar, then maybe we'll bring it back around to kind of the Calf Action Network. So we do have a survey going on at the moment where we are collecting sort of input from the challenges people are experiencing to see what areas we can get the network to focus on. So yeah, if you could give some time, they're fairly, I think it's up to 10 questions per, whether you're a farmer, working in veterinary profession, an industry rep, or working more in research and innovation. Let us know kind of areas that you are thinking there's research gaps or challenges to overcome, and that will feed into the Calf Action Network's activities. And if you are also interested in joining the network, it's free to join. We have quarterly meetings and we chat about calves, so you can drop me an email. And there is one more question as well from the chat. Whey or skim-based milk, and what percentage of skim is best? Which might be a bit controversial for the last 3 minutes of our webinar. So very, very quick. Any inputs on that?
I think the biggest thing, we've done a lot of work looking at whey versus skim-based milk replacers, and the biggest thing is actually the quality of the protein that's in there, together with all the other ingredients in the milk formulation. So to be very quick, so I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but you know, we've got data showing, coupled with more historical data, that if you've got a good quality skim, with skim included at a high level, compared to a good quality concentrated whey protein milk replacer, then there's no difference in terms of calf growth. Your differences come when you're looking at different types of whey that have been processed differently. So processing temperature is important, and also the level of the skim, because in terms of what percentage of skim is best, the higher the better, because you're going to get a better clot formation. But it's not as simple as just whey or skim. It's actually the quality of that dairy protein that's absolutely fundamental.
Laura, the only thing I would add to that is that you do need a minimum of good quality skim. 18% is the minimum amount to actually form a clot in the stomach. So that's not something that you'll often find on milk replacer labels. But you know, as Jessica alluded to, you know, in terms of a sort of a high level that's acceptable, 18% is the minimum.
Great, thank you. So as we approach the final minute of the webinar, so thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. We've recorded it, so I will circulate an email via Eventbrite once we've processed that and got it online, so you can watch it again or share with people who might be interested but weren't able to join us live. And yes, so thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.